Great. So we're going to call to order the Finance and Administration Committee meeting for today, January 26th. And let's have a roll call, please.
Good morning, Chair Smith. Director Cush.
Here.
Director Russell. Director Sampson. Vice Chair Schmidt.
Present.
And Chair Smith.
Here. All right, great. And then I'll have a Larry just joined. Should we include him now?
I have it noted that he just joined. It's good.
Okay, great. And then we'll have a motion to adopt the agenda, please.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. And a roll call vote.
Director Cush.
Aye.
Director Russell. On mute, sir.
Aye.
Vice Chair Schmidt.
Aye.
And Chair Smith.
Aye. Great. And is there any public comment on the agenda?
Not on the adoption of the agenda.
Okay. How about is the next item to discuss any public comment on items not on the agenda?
That is correct. And there are none.
Okay. And is there any board comments on items not on the agenda? Okay, I have three that I'd like to bring up for discussion. And maybe we can have public comment at the end, but I would love board input on these three items not on the agenda. The first one is that I'd like to recommend that going forward, the chair of the Finance and Administration Committee be given the opportunity to confer with management about the agenda before it's publicly posted and have the opportunity to give feedback. I don't believe this is explicit in the policies and in the handbook. I think the only explicit discussion about conferring with the board is with the board meetings and with the president. My suggestion would be that each committee look at that chair to be able to have the opportunity to partner with the general manager and the team. But I'm just making this recommendation for the Finance and Administration Committee that happened. I don't know, Molly, if that's a vote or if that's a change or if that's already in here. But my purpose here is to try to have more board input on agenda items ahead of time with some opportunity to change them.
Understood, Chair Smith. What I would suggest is since we don't have an agendized item on this, that we hear your suggestion and request. We can, if there aren't any objections, I don't see any roadblock to making sure staff kind of loops in you as the chair of the Finance and Admin Committee. If we want to move forward with a broader discussion and policy for all of the committees going forward, I think that would be best handled as a fully agendized item on at a board meeting. So that,
Molly, if I could add, just for clarity, our practice has been we share the agenda for the board meeting with the president in advance. And we similarly now do so with committee chairs. I think a distinction that does warrant some broader discussion is we also have board policy on setting agenda items. So generally the review that's now provided is for clarification and to support the president running the board meeting or the committee chairs doing similarly. It's not necessarily to add agenda items or take off agenda items, which I do think may be some of the interest, and that does intersect to some degree with our board policy on setting agenda items. So I think staff, we're good with whatever direction the board wants to go, but in my view, it does make sense to think about it in context of a broader discussion.
Yes, thanks for that clarification, General Manager, because I was understanding that it was just a review of the agenda that we were talking about, which I don't think, necessarily warrants a change to the board handbook or board policy at this point. But if we're talking about, impacting different agenda items or directing agenda items for each committee, I think that would be a broader discussion, and we would want to have that clarification at the board level.
Great. Yeah, that is what I'm
Because
talking about.
we do have currently a rule for board agenda items.
Yep.
That it's a first and a second from the board.
Right. So thank you for the clarification. That is what I'm looking for, to be able to have some input on agenda items and before they're posted, and to have a conversation with and potentially add or take away or help give some ideas around it.
Okay, so I think staff can take that suggestion and then bring an item for discussion with the board.
Great.
And
I'd love to have comments from the directors that are on the call now, if that's okay about this. Is that all right?
Well, we don't want to go too far on this
Okay.
topic if it's not on the agenda.
Great.
So
Okay. Well, think about it.
yeah, food
All
for
right.
thought, right?
I'll try to not take up too much time. I do have a couple more. So what I've noticed in recent meetings is that there's been a lot of heavy discussion, but I kind of feel like the staff may not be getting the direction from the board that they may be looking for. And one thing that I have done in meetings that I have found extremely helpful would be at all meetings, and I'd love to have this for FNA, that there be clear goals articulated in the beginning of the meeting so that we all know what the staff is looking for. That's number one. Number two, that we report out on what our to-dos were from the last meeting and have some accountability to make sure that they got done, or where we stand with those action items. Number three, that at the end of the meeting, after the staff reporting and content and public comment, that we review the goals that were set out in the beginning of the meeting, and that we have clear understanding of whether the goals were achieved by the staff or not, and whether the staff wants additional input. And then lastly, that we clearly articulate what the next steps are coming out of this meeting, to-dos, and a timeline to achieve those goals. And I can repeat that if you want, Molly.
I think I've got the list, and I'm hoping I'm not the only one taking some notes. But
Okay, well, it's recorded and I
It's
have it written.
recorded too.
it is recorded.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's, I mean, that's just kind of a meeting decorum that I find might be helpful in this organization. And I'd like to do it in this meeting. And I don't know if that is something that needs a vote or not.
No, I don't think so. I think Director Chair Smith, that all makes good sense. Now on items, we do note if it's either informational or with a recommended action. I think, broadening that up and having a discussion as we bring the specific item is a really good idea in terms of the interest or the goals of staff in bringing this, to be very clear. And when we have a recommendation, to really speak to what that is and why we're looking for a certain direction.
Great, because I definitely have felt like I want to make sure the staff's getting what they want out of this, and I think this might be a way to do it. So, and then my last one is for the FNA committee that we add agenda items, and so I don't know exactly how to do this, Molly, so you'll tell me how to do it, but that we add the administrative side of our charter to look at on a quarterly and annual basis: diversity and inclusion metrics, open hires, churn and why people may have left, staff culture and morale, opportunities for improvement, and 360 reviews. Those kinds of staff and management support, I think, could be helpful, and I'd love to bring that back on a quarterly basis and with the group's approval. And Molly, I'm not sure exactly what needs to be approved here, I'd love to maybe sit down with Ben and whoever and talk about which of those items would be in an executive session and or which of those items are we can do on a quarterly or annual basis, and then start to map out how they would be on the agendas.
Yeah, so I think that, staff can take some direction from that, and, Ben can weigh in on this, as far as, bringing those items at future meetings as you're suggesting. Some of them, as you point out, are, may involve personnel issues or information that we wouldn't share in a public setting, but that, metrics and a broader look at that, those kinds of issues, I think, wouldn't be inappropriate for the FAC. And I think there actually is a discussion coming up, at the board retreat on some of those items, if I recall correctly. But I don't know that we, at this point, I think we can just understand that interest in that goal and then, work with it. And if there are specific agenda items, again, it sounds like we're going to be looking at how the board can adopt a policy on how those things can be added at committee level. And again, just a clarification for everyone here today, as our committee meetings are currently noticed as special board meetings, does allow action. However, we do have a policy that they are intended primarily, because our next item, one of our items today is an exception, primarily for informational items, and to move things from there to full board meetings for action. So again, we do have some parameters to work with, but I think sharing information on those topics is good thing for us to look at.
Great.
Yeah,
And I'm
and
looking for that.
would just,
Yeah.
sorry, Jed. I was
Yep.
just going to briefly add, if I could, that many of these items will be talked about at the board retreat and will flow from the retreat, where we develop milestone dates and goals for the coming years, to briefings at the committee. So I think staff is very much headed towards the direction you're suggesting. And as you'll see, as we get into the retreat, these topics generally are covered, and those that aren't, I'd expect a discussion at the retreat, and we'd identify kind of these board goals that then would be brought to be updated through the year at the committee. So I think we're
Great. Awesome. Yeah. And I'm looking like specifically for a quarterly review of these items.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Any other items not on the agenda anyone wants to, I guess I already gave that opportunity, but I think we can move on.
Yeah, I'll just simply say thank you, Chair Smith and Ben and staff for already the work I know that you folks are looking to present at our board retreat. These are some of these topics are things that we've been highlighting, I think, over the last year, and we're glad to hear that that you're already taking some steps in the right direction to bring these things forward in response to our past requests. So thank you for your work, and look forward to seeing what we hear on the board retreat.
Great. So I'd like a motion to approve the minutes from the F&A committee meeting from, I believe, December 22nd.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call.
Director Kush,
Aye.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Vice Chair Schmidt,
Aye.
and Chair Smith.
Aye. And do we need an approval for continuing the virtual board meeting? Is that right? Nope, we're good.
If I may, Chair Smith, I'll give some further explanation on this item. So I did hear an interest from the board to continue to allow virtual meetings. We do still operate under an emergency proclamation by the governor's office. I'm still hearing that it's set to expire the end of February. However, given that we always have some uncertainty in this area, I think it was appropriate to agendize this today for an exception to our not taking approval action. The last time we visited this and adopted a resolution was was January 3rd. And I think having this move forward today rather than putting it off further will just help add clarity for staff, for the board, and for the public that we will continue to allow virtual meetings where appropriate. And for the next, and that allowance would continue again for the next 30 days from this action. So that's why it's on the agenda today for approval.
Got it. Thank you. And I'll look for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call.
Director Kusch,
Aye.
Director Russell,
Aye.
Vice Chair Schmidt,
Aye.
and Chair Smith.
Aye. Great. So now we'll get ready to hand this off to the staff, reviewing our monthly financial update, our capital investment in upcoming budget cycle and rate setting process. And maybe as a cold call, Brett and Ben, please let us know what goals you want to achieve in this meeting and how we can make sure that we achieve them and review it at the end.
Brett, I would, why don't I start? The first item is the routine monthly update. That's informational and the opportunity to answer any questions. The item on capitals, we'll talk about when we get there on that. We're looking for moving towards direction and understanding of the board of the alternatives you'll have in terms of capital investment this coming year. In the last item, we're going to focus on our reserve limit, similar to capital in terms of it being, I suppose, a lever that we have as we think about the upcoming rate cycle.
And would you want specific feedback and guidance on those last two items?
I think at this point, it is a committee. What we're looking for clarity and alignment in terms of where we're going. So I do think on the capital, we want to begin to converge on the alternatives that the board would like to see in context of the rate setting and kind of a sense, I think, at this point of where the board may be interested in heading. And I think probably on both of those items, that's a fair characterization. Brett, does that work for you?
Yeah, definitely. I agree fully. I think at this point in the process, we're, like, as you mentioned, we're kind of narrowing the options and kind of trying to elicit feedback and direction. I think in the coming weeks, we'll need more final decisions, but I think today is more informational so that the board understands kind of where staff is coming from in our recommendations, and then also so staff understands direction given from the board to help winnow down the options.
Great, go for it. Thank you.
Okay. So good morning, board. My name is Brett Uppendahl. I'm the finance director here at the district. I have two items. I have the first and the third item here. The first one is a financial update. This is an item we give each and every month. I'm going to be a little bit more brief on this one than in prior meetings. First, because there's not a lot of change in kind of the month-to-month numbers we've been seeing, but secondly, because as Ben was referring to, the next two items have probably more of an in-depth discussion and more of an impact going forward. So I'm certainly happy to answer any questions along the way, but I just want to let you know I'm going to go through this a little bit more succinctly than I have in the past. Revenues here is the first slide, as we do, like I said, every month. Again, 50% of the fiscal year. This is all through December reporting. We'll talk about some of the nuance here on the next slide, but as you kind of just scroll down the right hand side in terms of percent to actuals on our budget, we're really largely in line in all categories for the linear kind of math of the fiscal year. Other revenue is a very small portion. You can see there 2.7 million budget, 2.3 million actual. The biggest driver there is just as we're realizing some of the grant revenues we do have. We don't budget our grant revenues up front necessarily. They're multi-year and they kind of come in as we get reimbursements. And so small number, but it's driving the percent of budget higher in that particular category, but it's not necessarily noteworthy in the sense of unplanned revenue. This is one of the slides that I really, I've been focusing on the last few, months or so, and it continues to hold true. And this is one that has a little bit more impact, going forward in terms of our financial projections. And in particular, it's this concept that, with our water sales is our biggest, variable revenue source. And so the three columns you see, water sales, service charge, watershed fee. The one on the left there, water sales, that's our variable rate. That depends on how many CCFs or gallons of water are used here in the district. The other two are fixed fees, and so they're much more stable. Again, this is a 2-month lag. And so when we're looking at December numbers or through December, we're really seeing primarily, through October and November in terms of real usage. What I wanted to point out, and what I've mentioned the last few months, is even though on the bottom, you see the bottom columns there, I've added some highlights. So percent of the annual budget, 50% seems good on the surface. But, because a large portion of what you're seeing there is really the kind of those heavy, drier summer months in terms of July, August, September, October, even into November, for what that represents in usage, we're actually only 82% of where we would expect to be at this time. So translating that the other way, we're 18% behind our budget in terms of where we would want to be at this time of the fiscal year. 6 months still left in the billing cycle. We're starting to see kind of a little bit of an uptick month by month, but really the message here is that we're continuing to see this really low demand, historically low demand in terms of overall water sales. And so that is something that we have to incorporate into our longer term projections that will affect future budgets and future rate cycles. And so that really is the key thing on this slide, is that even though we're 50% linearly through the year in our water sales, that's actually 18% behind where we would expect to be if we were just purely on a budget basis there. So
And
that's kind of,
Brett, just as a reminder, just the budgeted amounts were based on lower consumption amounts from previous date. The budgeted amounts account for reduced consumption already, so we're below the levels that had been anticipated. Is that right?
So actually, I think the way that I would look at that is the budgeted levels were on a 2-year budget cycle. So those were largely
Right.
set a year and a half ago before we really got into the drought. So it's more so that those are set on kind of the expectation pre-drought and, before we had this lower demand. So those are actually at a higher level, the budget is. The variation between months is more of an historical kind of expectation, multiple years average, but the bottom line of $60.8 million down there, and that was based on 2 years ago's budget and essentially 4 years ago's rate cycle inputs. And so that's what we're catching up to. We're seeing in reality on the ground, we're kind of in a lower demand, period, whereas we're comparing ourselves to what was set at kind of a historical average pre-drought. So that's kind of the big rub there.
Thank you.
I think this is a really important point. There's a couple things that are happening in here. One is, I just think the budget that we set 2 years ago was based on a long-term trend of wetter, frankly, more kind of there were dry years in the average, but there also was a wet year. And I just think we ultimately set a budget on a set of numbers that we weren't, even though we were thinking we were going into a drought, our budget didn't reflect that we were expecting to go into a drought or that we were expecting dry year conditions. And that's why we continue in part to see this gap. Another piece of it I think is really interesting is that even when we get away from, we're in these wet year periods, parts of the year where typically we would see a reduced consumption because we're no longer doing outdoor irrigation. I think what we're also seeing is that people are conserving water inside their homes and continuing to, and that's both encouraging, but I think it also means we really do, as we set our budget and do our rate setting process, that we really need a different, I think, mindset about what we think water consumption will be. And we all know that there is usually a rebound when we get back into a wet cycle from a conservation period. But I think we need to also test our assumptions about how much rebound we might even expect to see, if any at all.
Yeah, and building on that, Monty, I would love us to start to articulate conservation as a great thing, and somehow this slide makes it come across as it's bad for us. But conservation, like we should be, as we go through the rate setting process going forward, be something that we reward. And as we think about drought-based pricing, then the less people use, then the less chance the rates will go up. So I think we can turn this around to be a positive message about saving water, and that message can come out of the rate process. So that's a nod to you, Adrian, to word it better than I just did.
And I think those are all really great points. And it really is a tough balance between kind of looking at, the kind of the shorter term mindset of, a budget, the fiscal year and the revenues, kind of that medium term mindset of this, rate cycle period and which assumptions we use, and I think Director Schmidt, to your point about how much you can look to a long-term, flat average and project that forward. That's kind of this whole, climate change and how much does the past, kind of inform the future. And then also, Director Smith, I think you make a really good point about, it is a positive message. It's just a really strange dynamic with utility financing, being a utility that we are, and having to, earn our revenue based on a dollars per unit type of a metric. That's just a really kind of weird math to explain. And so Adrian and I will work hard on trying to explain that more succinctly and something that makes sense. As we look into projections, again, here, this is, we fill this graph in 1 point at a time through the year. You can see, I think this is part of what we started talking about, is that last year, we really started to diverge from the budget in this October, November timeframe, when we really were, starting to see, the implications of what could be, a really, serious drought. And so you see that divergence last year, September, October, and that really maintained all the way, through the year. It didn't get bigger after November, December, but it really maintained. So we didn't see a rebound last year in fiscal 22 on the left-hand side. This year, we're trending closer to the budget. If you kind of look at, the overall distance between the green and the blue dots there. But we're certainly not seeing much of a rebound. We're kind of seeing the steady kind of, this is the new, the word new normal gets thrown around all the time, but this is kind of our new, baseline. And it seems to be, at least, from the data speaking, more of a permanent trend, or at least a trend that has some degree of permanence to it. And so I think that that gets into this idea of how much can you, take past patterns and apply it going forward. We'll have to keep on looking at the data and projecting going forward. I think the good news on there, as you can kind of see, is that we're closer to the budget than last year. So hopefully the losses in real numbers won't be as stark as they were last year. But as it shows there on the right hand side, this year to date, we're about $6.5 million behind our budget. In kind of rough math, we're 6 months through the year, $6 million down. So we're essentially running a shortfall of about $1 million a month when you look at it this way. Next slide, and then these kind of all build on the same theme of just kind of the historic nature of where we're at in comparison to the district's history. And so the call out box on the right shows as of December, right? So 6 months through the year compared to as of December each of the prior years, at least for the prior 7 years on the slide. We're 24% reduction in terms of overall demand from fiscal 21, which was a high point, right? So we're still below the high point. We've had a little rebound compared to last year, which has been helpful. That kind of was shown on the last graph. We're a little bit tighter to the budget than we were last year at this time, but we're still 17% below our long-term average, 10 to 15-year average for where we're at. So, as I look at it, we other than last year, the first 6 months that we've had this year have been the lowest in the last 20 years or so, and I can get records going back farther than that, but our billing system shows us the last 20 years and 6 months of usage. Like I said, other than last year, this is the lowest 6 months in the last 20 years. And so, really trying to project that going forward is the challenge. But I think it also, this slide in particular, just speaks to kind of this historic low that we're in. This, where do we go from there is obviously the question that we'll be answering in the next couple months. 2 more slides here. Expenses, again, not much change from prior, months reports, in the sense that, we're tracking the way we expect to be tracking at this time. There hasn't been any surprises as we're looking through the expense budget. We've talked about personnel services being the one kind of item that's lower than the others and lower than you would expect on a full budget. And that's been intentional as we've been trying to limit our expenses where we can in terms of staffing, just as we try to kind of patch things together on the the budget side in terms of revenues and expenses. So we've been holding back on hiring intentionally there, not without consequence, as has been discussed in prior meetings, but that is kind of one of the bigger buckets that we have control of. The rest of the costs there are largely fixed, and so they're right on track for the year. And as we've discussed in prior meetings, capital expenditures are we don't expect those to be as linear. You know, those kind of come up and down as we get invoiced and as some of the bigger projects make their way through. So we're at 60% of the year over there on the capital side, but that's not necessarily a data point that is concerning at this point. It's just kind of more of a timing mechanism. And so, you know, as I look at the expenses, this is again, you know, no surprise about what we'd expect to be and not much change from the last month. So this slide I do want to take a minute on because this is the one where we do have some changes, and this is reflective of the recent rains that we've had. And so, you know, I think, you know, a common question, and, you know, would be, you know, it's rained more now, isn't the district in a better financial position? And so the answer to that simply is yes, right? We're in a better position as we look forward. What I've done with this chart here is, you know, a couple things. You can kind of see this, the strikeouts and some of the, you know, changes in the numbers there. So kind of first going down the text on the left-hand side, we have been holding funds, you know, throughout the year, holding funds of our reserves, saying we need to earmark these in case we have another, you know, historic drought year. And so until we saw, you know, evidence of you know, sufficient rain to kind of change that, we kept holding it, right? So the first 5 months of the year, we said we need to hold enough money to really pump in water from Sonoma, and we really need to hold enough money to pump Sulahule if needed, right? What this shows in the strikeouts there is that, you know, the last month of incredible rains has, number one, taken away the need to hold money for Sulahule. That's not an option we need to necessarily be considering at this point. So that's completely, you know, taken down from 1.5 million down to 0. And then in terms of water purchased, you know, I think we're getting closer and closer to think that, yeah, we won't have to purchase a lot of water from Sonoma, but we, you know, one storm doesn't solve the entire, you know, kind of drought. And I know we're thinking more in a multi-year, you know, level here. So rather than saying we don't need it at all, I think we looked at this and consulted with operations. And I think we figure at this point, as long as we hold, you know, about half of what we expected, you know, throughout earlier the years.
Right. Could I,
sure, Ben.
just to be more specific on what we did, we looked at where we stand this water year, and if it doesn't rain anymore, what things would look like. So we've maintained a very conservative projection, and more specifically, pumping Sulahule, with it being our system full now, we are not seeing the need this year, even with no more rain, to do that this fiscal year. On the 5,000 to 2,500 of water purchase, that's really based upon hydraulic limitations. So if it doesn't rain anymore, we would expect in conversations with the board that we would want to ramp up beyond our minimum to get as full as we can. And we're projecting we'd be hydraulically limited now by 2,500 additional acre feet. And that really comes from, because of the rains, and prior we had curtailments from Sonoma Water, just to get the minimum water. We're currently about at half of our minimum. So we're about at 2,600 acre feet from Sonoma. So to get to our minimum 5,200 and then an additional 2,500, if we end up doing that, that would be the maximum capacity we'd be able to take. So Brett, can you, we aren't showing the reduction, the difference on the dollars that these assumptions now make.
Yeah, and so I'm getting there to that, but I think, you know, to your point, so pumping of Sulahule was a $1.5 million kind of hold earmark against our reserves, and then the full 5,000 acre feet would have been 6.6 million. So, you know, now those two combined, you know, we were holding, you know, a little over 8 million, and now we're holding 3 million, 3.3 million. So it's improved the bottom line by 4 to 5 million. That's kind of, you know, what you're getting at here. So $4 to $5 million of reserves we don't need to hold for this, you know, this year, that just flows through to the projected ending balance, which is a better number now, like I said, by about $4 to $5 million.
Ben, can I just ask a clarifying question? In terms of the limitations of the amount of water that we could take, are you talking about in terms of what you project as our storage, our ability to store, or our ability to take water from Sonoma and transmit it through our system, such that our system is the bottleneck of capacity?
Yeah, it's the latter, President
Okay.
Schmidt. It's just the hydraulic limitations of how much water we can take.
Okay, thank you.
And the final change here again, and I don't expect you guys to have remembered, each and every nuance of the slide in the past, but you may recall that in the past we had 3 different scenarios in terms of water sales reductions going across the top. We had a 25% scenario, a 20%, and a 15%. And so again, based on kind of the data we've seen as of 6 months of the year, we've taken the 25% scenario and we're not showing that anymore because, as I mentioned in a couple previous slides, we're seeing about an 18% reduction in overall revenues. And knowing that we've had the rain and it's unlikely that we're going to be really pushing for that next level of conservation, we think this 20 and 15% are much likely to be the tighter range as we go forward. And so again, that knocks out some of those worst case scenarios that we were holding funds aside for, and puts us in this kind of more comfortable range of the bottom line there, ending the year with $24 to $27 million in our unrestricted reserve account. So all good news there. I mean, I think that's kind of the gist of this, is that this is a good news slide. I think for many of us and for many reasons, and certainly on the finance side, it was not a comfortable place to be in the dry parts of the fall and whatnot. And so this is kind of the financial improvement that we can show coming from having a good rain.
Brett, sorry, just on that slide, could you just remind me at least again, just the very last item, the use of CMF for debt service. So in these projections, you are eliminating that application of the CMF, which then funnels an additional 8.8 million towards the unrestricted reserves. Is that right?
So I think it's to clarify that. So that assumption didn't change. So that's the bottom line, their use of CMF for debt service. So we're still intending to use CMF to pay our debt service this year. And so the way to read this kind of going down is that your beginning balance 27.4 in the 20% column. We're going to lose $12 million or so in water sales losses. We're going to have some unexpected expenditures here and there, and paving costs, as we may talk about later, those still continue to rise on us. So we'll update that. But our overall operating income loss is expected to be somewhere in that 12 million range, meaning that we would otherwise end the unrestricted reserve, which is kind of what the slide is speaking to, at 15 million. So 15 million in our unrestricted reserve is really low compared to prior years. And so we still are planning to bring in debt service funding from CMF, and that should offset the use of our unrestricted reserve. And so it'll essentially make our unrestricted reserve, a higher balance, 24 million, than it would have otherwise been at 15 million. So bottom line, we're still planning to use the CMF revenues to apply them towards debt service.
This fiscal year.
Right.
This fiscal year, yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the last slide here, and again, I mentioned I was going to be brief because we have 2 other items here, in terms of kind of more in-depth discussion, but, we're continuing to see our financial challenges in 22 that we had in 22 continuing in fiscal year 23, the current year. As I just mentioned, some of those are beginning to recede a little bit, and so that's been a positive sign. And we'll still have to kind of look at, dependent on rainfall and water conservation levels and on budget expenses, such as the paving costs, as I mentioned, as we make our way through the rest of the year. So we'll continue to update this overall, projection and incorporate that into the next year's budget process. And then, as we've talked about, we are taking targeted actions to reduce our expenditures in the short term while we have time to evaluate our longer term balancing options. And one thing I would add that I don't have in the slide here, but I have in the staff report, is also just as a general kind of announcement, is that we have completed our financial audit for fiscal year 22. And so staff has been working with the external auditors, and we completed that and sent it off to the state. And so that is now posted on our website for the public and or any other interested party to look at. And I think as you look at that, just as kind of a brief summary, and not to get into the accounting of the district, but we had a couple of favorable one-time accounting transactions that helped the district. And primarily what it was that, as we look at our retiree liabilities, those are heavily linked to the stock market performance and CalPERS. They're about a year behind us, and so they're recognizing their gains from actually June of 2021. Those have made their way through their calculations of future liabilities. And so what that does is there was a big gain in fiscal year 21 that actually reduces a lot of our future liabilities, and so it reflects very positively on our our net position, which is kind of the bottom line. How is the agency doing? And so despite the fact that we had lower revenues last year, and we were able to cut some expenses, but it really is this kind of one-time adjustment coming from stock market gains of fiscal year 21 that's being recognized and kind of making its way through our financials. So it's good news if you look at it on the surface, and certainly good news. We always want to have help in that area, but I think many of us know that the next year, fiscal year 22, did not have such good stock market returns. So, and when I look at it, I expect those trends to reverse themselves next year. And so, we'll take the good news while we have it on a one-time basis, but it does not necessarily change the forward look. I think we know in real time that that's going to continue to be a challenge on that side. So just wanted to make that announcement that is posted on the website, and I'd be happy to take a further dive in future meetings. But we just wanted to let this board know that that is up there now on the website.
Hi, Brett. We have historically always, that audit has been run past us before it went out the door. I'm a little bit surprised that that didn't happen, but in any case, could you please distribute the audit to the board directly? And that way, and then I think you should be scheduling a agenda item to discuss the audit in more detail. You did a nice job there of summarizing, but it was pretty quick. And just give us a little more input.
I'd be happy to do that. Yep.
So we don't have an audit committee or an audit review process that's formalized?
No, not necessarily as formalized. I mean, we have our requirements with the state. We work with the external auditor, and then typically the audit is there for discussion as needed, but not as far as I'm aware. And Ben or Molly can correct me, but we don't have a formalized audit committee as far as I know.
Well, I would say this committee has typically served it as that, and a good practice, and I think we should do it as Director Russell is noting, we bring the auditor to an upcoming meeting that presents to the board the audit and responds to any questions this committee may have in it, kind of runs through the audit itself and any findings and that sort of stuff, and has the board engage in that discussion.
I mean, absolutely. I'm kind of surprised it's not required that the board be involved and have a report from the independent auditor. So yes, let's do that. Great. Thank you, Brett. Do we go to public comment now, or any comments that anyone wants to make before? I think they did.
Typically, chair would be the purview of the chair to solicit any comments from the board members, and then public comment, of course, if there is any.
Great. Why don't we go for it? I'll call Ron Jeeves, since you're not on mute. Any quick comments or thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, I think we've covered
Okay.
everything.
Monty,
Same. I think we're good.
Larry, anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Brett and Ben for adjusting the sheet we just saw with respect to our comments from the last time we discussed this. So thank you.
Great. All right. Any public comments, Terry?
There are none.
Wow. Okay. Next up.
Hi there, Crystal Yasmin, Director of Engineering. So the next item is capital investments in the upcoming budget cycle. The board had asked us to come back with some details on the level of investment that would be needed for different scenarios in terms of the backlog of assets that need renewal and replacement. And so we're going to present that today. And I know Director Smith, you asked for what direction we'd be asking. And as Brett pointed out, we'll be coming back to the board with how these different levels of investment would impact rates in future rate proceedings. So today is just to give you an idea of the different alternatives that are available, that are out there. And then I'll pass it over to Alicia Irish, our planning manager for engineering, and she'll give the presentation.
Thank you.
Good morning, directors. Alicia Irish here. I'm engineering manager. I do have a presentation for you this morning. This morning, we'll be talking about capital investment in this upcoming budget cycle. Today, we'll be starting by reviewing some of our historical capital investments and then going over, like Crystal mentioned, some investment scenarios and some of our asset classes. And then we'll touch upon some system improvement needs and near-term large projects. And finally, go over some approaches for capital investment in this coming budget cycle. Looking at our historical capital investments, this table here shows our historical investments over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, we've invested $217 million into our capital program, and I've completed 16 tank projects, replaced over 50 miles of pipeline, completed 4 pump station rehabilitations, as well as completing some larger treatment plant projects and some emergency landslide repairs from the storms of early 2018. Looking forward, we can now go into some investment scenarios for 3 of our major asset classes: storage tanks, pipelines, and pump stations. This chart here shows our current inventory of tanks, 128 tanks, and they're plotted by age of years since installation or rehabilitation and color-coded by tank material type. The arrows at the top also indicate some standards, and these are just standards. All of our assets warrant periodic inspection, and they may need to be addressed either sooner than these standards or after. But we can assume that these are reasonable average periods for evaluation. Honing in on the 65 welded steel tanks in our system, we can see here that they're now plotted by the same axis by age. And using that 25-year period, we can see that there are currently 30 out of the 65 welded steel tanks would be considered past due for rehabilitation. If we were to project out 5 years' time, and in that 5 years not perform any tank rehabilitations, that number would grow from 30 to 40. So there would then be 40 welded steel tanks that would be overdue in the next 5 years. And you can see how the blue bars, which is the current inventory today, shift to the right in the orange bars. If we were to take a different scenario now, going back to our current inventory, and perform 2 welded steel tank projects per year, 2 tank recoatings per year for the next 5 years, that number would remain at 30 tanks overdue for recoating. And we can think of a good ballpark to recoat a 1 million gallon tank is about $2 million. So with this scenario here, we would be investing $10 million into our welded steel tank program over the next 5 years. Expanding back out again and looking at all of the tanks in our system, this chart here is looking at the major tanks in our system, so 114 of the 128. We can look at 3 different scenarios and how the impact to backlog is affected. And you can see here the 3 scenarios are with no rehabilitations per year, 2 tank rehabs per year, and 5 tank rehabs per year. Our baseline in the past few years has been about 1 tank per year, but you can see even with investing in 5 tank rehabilitations per year, our backlog does not go down to 0 for over another 20 years.
Can we stop there for just 1 second, Alicia? Thank you so much. This is a really, really helpful analysis that I would love to see on all of our assets, just because it really helps put into perspective how we are different strategies we might adopt to deal with this to get ourselves to where we don't have a backlog of past due tanks. So thank you. I want to just ask one quick question, which is when these things are past due based on, I know that that's like a standard and that you can go out, you got to go out there and you take a look and you go, oh, wow, it's fine and it's got another 5 years. Or you go out there and you're like, wow, we should have done it 5 years back, where it's at near failure. When we go out, and I know there's a lot of factors that go into what you see when you get there. Typically, when we go out at these these standard times, what do we see? are we finding that that's pretty much a good standard to apply for our district? And or are we seeing things are fine or what?
So we actually performed a recent condition assessment for all of our tanks during the 2020-2021 time period. And as you can imagine, it's a lot of data that was collected, data from coating condition to fall protection. And we did a very comprehensive look at all of our tanks, and we are just now going through all of the data. So we'll have to come back and kind of report back on how our tanks are kind of evaluated against that standard. But for right now, we're using this sort of industry standard that's based on pretty high level data.
Alicia, I would not refer to it as an industry standard. It may be an industry criterion, but it's surely not a standard. It's not codified in any AWWA documentation that I'm aware of. So
I think that's a good point.
That's a really good point. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. We're looking, just as these rules of thumb, maybe that's a better way to put it. And we do recognize that we need to be inspecting our facilities on a regular basis, and we need to see kind of where our particular facilities fall within that rule of thumb. We are seeing some of our facilities that will extend beyond that reasonable period, and we are seeing some of our facilities that will need to be addressed prior to that period. In response to Director Smith's question, I think you're looking for some more detail to that question, and we'll need to get back to you as we further evaluate our condition assessment.
And then if I could add, one project in particular, the Wolfback Ridge tank is needing recoating before the 25-year period. And the fact still remains that we do have a backlog of tanks that need recoating on our list. So
I think it's important though, and Monty, you ask a great question, because it's like saying, what's the average life of paint on a car? It goes all over the place depending on how the car has been treated and what it's doing. What's the purpose of the coating? What's the purpose of the paint? It isn't an issue of failure. The tank isn't going to fail because the coating failed. It's a water quality issue. It's keeping the water away from the tank materials, which in the first case is rust, impacting water quality. But the ultimate goal, like paint on a car, is to keep the environment off of the steel. So there's a two-factor, but it doesn't mean because the coating has failed, it doesn't mean there's anything more than a coating failure or a spot in your paint. It's not like the tank's going to fail because the coating failed. You use the term failure, and I want to be careful about those kind of terms, but your question was right on, and it's important to look at the conditions, and Alicia is doing the right thing of doing the ground proofing. What's the condition in a tank as opposed to what the general is? This presentation is fine. It's still very valid in terms of generalities, but we own specific tanks, not generalities. So we need your next level, which is to say, what are the actual conditions?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that where I'm getting at is we're trying to make long-term projections, and we have to have some sort of assumption, recognizing that in reality we will see different things. But when we're talking, we're looking at strategies here that at a minimum play out for another 20 years, or even more. So we have to have some level of assumption about what, whether that 25 or 30 years, some sort of period is a reasonable planning assumption, just so that we plan accordingly and we actually do what I think we really want to do, which is bring that number down to some much more manageable level, maybe all the way backlog down to zero, but
I think the more important thing, Monty, is to address the tanks that need addressing. And I don't think you need to make any assumptions. I think you need to work on facts. This is an observable condition. It's not easy to assess the interior coating, but it's easy to open the lid on the tank and look at the wall and see if the coating looks okay or it doesn't look okay. I believe all of the tanks are cathodically protected. Alicia?
That's correct. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so there's a belt and suspenders here. The cathodic protection is in there to protect the coating, the tank, when the coating fails. The whole idea is the protection goes to where the holidays are. So if there's an opening in the coating, the cathodic protection will flow electricity to that spot so the tank doesn't rust. So we have a better situation than just an unpainted rusty old tank. Although I'm getting a little tired, Ben, of looking at Castagna tank on the outside when I pass it. I think we need to do something with that, at least to market, paint over the patch that you can see from the freeway, because it does not look good. Anyway.
Yeah. So anyway, I thank you, Alicia, for this. This is really helpful. I think, when you've had time to look through the data and kind of pair up what we're seeing versus where they are at a standard, that gives us a sense of, should we continue to sort of more or less make an assumption out into the future that 25 years is the time frame we ought to plan around, of course, making more accurate decisions as we get closer, moving others up or out, depending on what we actually see.
And Director Russell, we have received notice from Sonoma County Water Agency that they do plan on rehabilitating Castagna Tank, and we've been working with them on when that might occur, because it will affect our ability to import water. But that tank is under the responsibility of Sonoma County. It's their tank there.
So Alicia,
I'm glad to hear that,
Crystal,
because I wasn't sure if that came with the pump station or not. But I'm glad to hear that they're going to deal with it.
can you maybe educate me about our thought process here? And this is great and helpful. I'm wondering, can we identify a cost associated with not rehabilitating a tank in the future at some point? So can we look out and say, if we don't fix a tank in 20 years, it's going to cost us X dollars. The net present value of that future expense is X. And then you should be able to quantify the optimal near-term investment. And since we have the opportunity to have a decades-long view of capital investments like this, I would imagine that we can make a very clear capital investment strategy plan going forward that would minimize long-term expenses. Did that make sense?
Yes, we have a very good case study on that with Smith saddle tanks.
Right.
Recently did extensive evaluation on different costs for either rehabilitating the tank or replacing the tank, which it's at a point now that we are going to go with replacement. But that analysis could be informative to how we go about it.
Yeah, it's like if we don't fix a tank, then we're going to have a Smith saddle, multi-million-dollar investment needed. And so how do we look and make sure that we don't get caught again like that? And then we can look and then that should influence the plan, I would imagine. And per Director Russell's comment, going at this on a case-by-case, tank-by-tank basis, you should be able to let us know what the right dollar number is, rather than 2 or 5. I don't know what that means, but we should be able to pinpoint a long-term annual investment plan that we can fund.
We can work towards that. Yes. I mean, I think really getting into the condition assessment and projecting out needed projects will certainly get towards that answer. I believe what this chart and what this particular general analysis is trying to show is that if we don't do anything, it's going to be costing more than if we accelerate our tank program. And even with the general standard, knowing that it's just a rule of thumb, to have 30 of our 65 tanks that would be considered overdue, we most certainly will need to be investing more into our welded steel tank program than we have in the most recent years.
Got it.
I don't understand your comment, Alicia. How do you get cost tied into this?
Well, in the last 10 years, we have completed 16 tank projects. Some of those have been tank recoatings and some of those have been redwood tank replacements. And the majority of those projects have been completed in the 5 to 10 year time frame, as opposed to the more recent 5 years or less time frame. If we continue to stay on track with what we've been doing in the most recent years, the tanks will continue to age, and the age since recoating will continue to grow, and the deterioration of the tanks will continue to increase. So
Perhaps, but you're ignoring the cathodic protection. I mean, that's the purpose of the cathodic protection. If the cathodic protection is not working, we need to revise the cathodic protection. The
Yeah,
cathodic protection could be designed to deal with an uncoated tank. It could protect an uncoated tank. The coating is a extra benefit, a Band-Aid put on the surface to keep the surface from rusting while the tank begins its initial life. But it long-term protects, but like I say, it's the cathodic protection that really
Right.
does the job.
Right, but Larry, that cathodic protection is only useful on the submerged parts of the tank. It's the stuff that, the part
That's
of the
true.
tank that's above the water line that's actually corroding faster.
That's true. Perhaps we need to look at ventilation then, Crystal.
so
You know,
I-
if the tanks were ventilated, I don't think you'd have that issue.
I think what will be informative is what we talked about, where we kind of calibrate this rule of thumb, this guidance with our actual inspections that we've done, and we bring that back to the board. I think that will really be the next step and will be informative in terms of going forward.
Yeah, and let's tie a next net present value cost of not doing this, right? If you know, that should drive the analysis. If we get nothing past due, are we going to save money long term? And there probably is a pinpoint that will make this make sense. But thank you. This is great.
So
Maybe,
now-
Jed, it's quite complicated because, as I said, it's not, you know, Crystal's point is excellent. The area above the water line, and maybe we need to look at our coating spec to see if we should be coating these differently, because obviously we're having problems. That's been the problem with the Smith Ranch tanks. That it's the coating failure up there has caused the damage that has occurred. But you know, like I say, coatings have changed a lot, and we need to make sure that we're using the best and get it under a warranty from the coating applier to say, hey, you promised us 20 years, we got 10 or whatever, and look at that. But the point is that the important impact to take away from this is that, yes, this is a good idea, but it does not result in failure. So I'm not so sure it's going to be so easy, Jed, to say, if you don't do this, it's like not painting your car. Does the car work if you don't paint it? Of course it works.
Yeah,
You know,
well,
it may not look good.
it seems to me like that we need to therefore further qualify what past due means. And
Well,
some
that's a
of
good
our
idea.
tanks might be more past due than others. And, you know, if I buy a car, per your example, from Boston, Massachusetts, it's going to have salt in the road and it's going to be more likely to be rusty. So let's look at on whether it's tank by tank or style by style, or however you want to break it down to figure out what past due means, and then we can get closer to what the future expense might be. Same with the
That's
piping.
a great comment. That's a
Right,
great comment.
let's keep going. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Larry.
All right, so pipelines, another major asset in our system. We've seen this chart before. This chart here shows our pipeline inventory of potable pipes, color coded by material and installed by decade. We can now look at this same inventory by age, also color coded, but in more material types, more distinct types. And we can start to look at these materials and we can assign various service lives. That's again, rule of thumb based on, you know, what we've been seeing, what other high level data has been seeing. And each of these materials has different service life attached to it. And using those rules of thumb, approximately 10% of our inventory would be considered past due for replacement. Again, we would be performing condition assessment. We would need to make sure that we would be replacing, the right miles of pipe and not just any mile of pipe. But looking at various scenarios like we did with storage tanks, we can see, how the backlog would be impacted with no pipeline replacements, worth 4 miles of pipeline per year, which has been our average over the past 5 years. And then the backlog with 8 miles of pipeline replaced per year, which has been the most amount we've replaced in a single year over the last 10 years. And with a $2 million cost to replace 1 mile of pipe, the 8 mile per year investment would be about $16 million into our capital program. And even with investing 8 miles per year, your backlog will continue to go up prior to it going down, and it will not go down to zero for over 40 years. And when we replace pipe, we want to look at things that are more than just age. We want to take into account material, areas of geohazards, areas of liquefaction, the criticality and risk that that particular pipeline presents to not only the district, but to our community, the consequence of failure of that pipeline breaking, as well as coordinating with the 11 jurisdictions in our area for their street paving work to minimize the public impact when these projects are being performed. Pump stations, another critical.
One quick cross-functional question on the pipeline replacement is I'm wondering how much we should be factoring in leak water loss into our water supply equations. In other words, how much are we losing by not replacing these pipes? There's one leak that I mentioned that's in Mill Valley that was detected that is not scheduled to be replaced until February 23rd, that with my calculation, holding a bucket under it is losing a gallon a minute. And that's 6 weeks before it will be replaced, which is 60,000 gallons of water going into Coyote Creek right now. So there's a cost to that. Can we link in pipe replacement, increased pipe replacement into our water supply and storage analysis?
That's an excellent question, Director Smith. And we do have data on the number of pipe breaks per year and the volume. We do reports to the Regional Water Quality Control Board on discharges from unplanned pipe breaks. And so we have all of that data, and we have shown that our pipeline work is keeping it pretty stable in terms of the number of breaks per year. We also have leak detection program where we go through sort of like the Golden Gate Bridge, listening with audio devices throughout the system, all 900 miles. We get through, we identify leaks that are, you can't see because a lot of it's underground, you don't see it. And so we'll listen for it and then have work orders to repair those spots. So, but yeah, we can have another presentation on that. I'm happy to bring that back.
Even just a quick number, like how many gallons or acre feet of water do we lose a year from busted pipes would be helpful. And then if we go from 4 to 8 miles, how much is that going to save us?
Yeah, there's an annual report to the state on non-revenue water loss. And that includes leaks as well as, metering accuracies and other places where we might lose water. So we can also give you that data at a future.
Love that. And maybe tie it in to Paul and his analysis.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's on the order of 10% of our water annual usage is non-metered water. But as Crystal said, that's both leaks and kind of meter differences based on how the water's metered. But
that's 2,500 acre feet lost.
in the ballpark.
I'll jump in, Jed. I don't know if Larry will agree with me, but that's actually a pretty good 10% non-revenue is actually, I would argue, pretty good for a supplier of our size. Of course, we can always improve on that, but
yeah, it's
agreed completely, Ranjiv. Yes.
It's in the ballpark. I mean, 10% is a number you do hear in the industry. And by definition, as you're noting, Director Cush, all pipelines inherently leak. You do need to keep an eye on the rate, because you don't want it increasing.
We can strive to do better, right? I mean, just because
Absolutely.
we're at industry standard, that doesn't mean that we can do better. So good to know.
Oh, 10% is better than industry standard. That was Ron James' point. That
Yeah.
it's a very good rate. I've had people in the water business smile at me when I tell them our rate, i.e. they don't believe it. But the don't underestimate, it's unaccounted for water. It isn't leaked. In large meters, a little bit of inaccuracy in a large meter is different than a little bit of inaccuracy in small meters. That's this thing they're talking about is we only know what we put in by what we meter in. You know, it isn't quantitative, it's just measured. And then we may know what we sold, and the difference is what they're talking about. So is it real? I don't know. You know, it surely there are leaks. And be aware, Jed, that we have an excellent group out there searching for these leaks, and they find a leak, as Crystal said, they fix that spot. They don't wait for a repair on that line. They dig the road and fix it. So that leak, when they find it, I don't know about the one in Mill Valley. That's, you know, I forget exactly how it works, Ben, but you have them categorized in level 1, level 2, level 3, or something like that. And that determines the response time, depending on how big the leak is.
That's correct.
Alicia, I wanted one point from this slide you're showing on how to prioritize pipeline replacement is maybe a piece of what would be helpful when we're talking about the storage tanks as well, because clearly not every tank is equivalent, not every mile of pipe is equivalent, as you're saying here. So this is, you know, maybe that risk-based analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. That was just what I was going to mention. We do take a risk-based analysis when prioritizing projects, because we do have a greater project need than we have investments to make in. So that risk-based assessment takes into account not just consequence of failure, as you'd see here, or the impact to the district and community if that asset were to fail, but also the likelihood of failure. And one of those categories in pipelines would be leak history. And there's a number of other things that would go into likelihood of failure, and then kind of taking those two evaluations together, likelihood and consequence, those would make up the risk that that particular asset would present to the district, and prioritizing that. And then, of course, you need to prioritize the assets against each other. Once you get your list of pipelines and your list of tanks, and you only have enough for a pipeline or a tank, which one would you pick? And that is like another complexity that gets into the risk-based analysis.
And then, of course, now the sector is starting to think a lot about climate resilience as another component of risk.
Right. So we'll get into that, and not just all of our projects are needs, right? You know, there's also opportunities to improve, and some of the projects that you may want to invest in, the pipe is not breaking, but this project would greatly improve your system. And we'll see some examples for that as we get further into this presentation.
Great.
So now looking at pump stations, we have 98 pump stations in our system. Here's the current age of our pump stations. We're currently in a comprehensive condition assessment for our pump stations, using district staff from many different departments to comprise that comprehensive assessment, and kind of taking a look at various investment scenarios here. We can see that we do have a similar challenge on the rate of replacement and impact to backlog as we project out into the future. So now touching upon, Director Cush, what you mentioned, some system improvements and large-term project needs. We do have a range of examples here that highlight some areas that are not just needs to our system, but areas that we could improve. And these examples range from isolating pressure zones to getting a tank to cycle more frequently, maintaining chlorine residual in our system, eliminating tanks, all the way to installing flush toilets on our watershed that sees millions of visitors per year. So there's really a range of opportunities that we have at our district to improve our system. And we also have some projects that have been delayed from our recent financial strain. And there's a range of examples here listed: roof replacement on our treatment plant, a transmission pump station rehabilitation, various dam improvement projects, pipeline replacement, as well as some tank projects such as the Wolfback Ridge tank and Smith Saddle design. And then, of course, there's some larger unfunded near-term projects that we've discussed at previous meetings. And these include not just the 6 projects that you see here, but we also need to understand that there will be some high priority water supply projects that will be the result of the water supply assessment roadmap. And now that we've kind of taken a look at some of our needs and opportunities, we need to look at some approaches for capital investment in this coming budget cycle. In terms of long-term capital planning, we'll be starting some discussion with the board in September 2023 to form a comprehensive long-term plan. And this long-term plan will also have medium and short-term components. And we aim to have these plans finalized by the spring of 2024. And we could think of this as like a 30-year, 10-year, and 4-year plan. Looking at various investment approaches that we could take for this coming budget cycle, starting in fiscal year 24, we could look at our financial alternatives to maintain our historical baseline investment. And we could also considering supplementing to that baseline through a modest bond issuance to accomplish some of those near-term larger project needs. Noting that about every $10 million of bond issuance will equate to approximately a 2% rate increase for debt service. And alternatively, we could also look at how rates would be impacted by increasing the baseline budget. And so,
Alicia, I have a question.
yes,
What is the interest rate assumed in the $10 million of bonds that equals the 2% rate increase? Do you know offhand?
I will need to get back to you on that unless Brett has an idea. But otherwise, I'll need to get back to you.
I'll report on that in the next item if that's okay, Director Russell. I have it here.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. There's no rush. It's a very interesting number for the folks to keep in mind on the board here. That so $100 million in bonding is 20% increase in rates to pay the bond retirement. So it's. But I'd like to know if you assume 4% or 2% or 6%. In that.
Let me check my notes. I'll check them and report out in just a minute.
Sure.
So in summary, there is a range of scenarios that are available to us to reduce our backlog of aging infrastructure. And we also need to account for those projects like system improvements and larger one-time projects. Noting that there's also a need for reserves for any unanticipated emergencies that might arise. This upcoming rate setting process will guide the short-term baseline plan. And the longer CIP plan discussion starting in September of 2023 will incorporate all of our ongoing capital planning elements, such as the water system master plan, the strategic water supply assessment, the watershed recreation plan, amongst others. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for choosing my house to show on the picture there a minute ago. You were looking right at Paradise Gate, right at my house, right where I'm sitting.
That's right.
I'd also like to say, Crystal, that the pavers did a great job on that repair on Paradise Drive. It is extra high quality. It looks great.
We finally had some dry weather to get that done. So.
Yeah.
Nice.
Maybe just one reminder. I feel like in our previous committee meeting, we had actually reviewed a CIP investment plan that looked at 3 or 4 different scenarios, and it was then a combination of those scenarios had been presented with budget figures. I can't remember if those were, I believe those were 10-year budget figures. How does that previous process and plan relate to what we're discussing now?
Yeah, that's really a good question. Before the drought, we developed a 10-year financial plan exercise with the board. Then the drought hit and kind of shifted a lot of things, of course, with the financial position we found ourselves in. So we were bringing this back because the old board hadn't had the benefit I mean, our newer board members of having gone through that exercise. I think at this point, what staff is thinking, but we definitely benefit from the thoughts of the board, is that we'll bring the baseline budget as we show different rate scenarios, including the baseline capital budget, and present to the board different options in how they would increase kind of the baseline rates, assuming we maintain the current capital level of investment. As a reminder, right, what we're going to bring is our current level of investment of the CIP, assuming that we aren't going to divert money for debt service, right? So this coming budget cycle, and then we would bring some options to the board. For example, we could do a small bond issuance of $45 million and do AMI and Smith Saddle, just illustratively. And that would increase, that would be another 2, 3, 4%, whatever it turns out to be on the rates. So the board could be able to look at that, or we could increase the CMF or the overall rate. So there's different ways, if the board wanted to increase the level of funding this coming rate cycle for the CIP. So we'll bring that as clear levers we wanted to bring today, to bring, complete the picture, which essentially for me, the picture is there's a lot of needs, a lot of work in front of us, some good planning needed as we think about 30-year plans, because we're talking about these long-term investments, as Alicia noted, and perhaps looking at some modest increases this coming, targeted increases this coming cycle.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And as you're developing these proposals that include that consider the changing circumstances, longer term planning, the relationships with rate setting, could you also include just that previous plan that had been discussed in the past, so that we have a reference point to see what we're comparing against or building upon?
Okay, yes, we'll do that.
Alicia, maybe, I don't know if it's embedded in what you were showing, the picture, different graphs of different levels of numbers of miles or of pipes or tanks and so forth. Do you know what our current level of investment, where that fits within those planning scenarios? Are we, I don't know, maybe
Yeah,
even
so
going back to the slides, but
I think I understand your question. Our baseline CIP historically has been about $20 million per year. Lately, we've been replacing about 4 miles per year of pipeline. So that's been about $8 million per year. We've also been recoding about 1 tank per year. So about $2 million, depending on the tank size. Pump stations have been a bit more variable. Sometimes they are on the tank lot, and sometimes they're a bit more independent, such as the Castania pump station. That was an emergency job due to our drought. And then I think as we get back to our baseline, we'll be able to come back towards the level of investment that we've been giving to our asset classes. We have been in a bit of a financial strain. But I think as we go through this rate setting process, we do have the great opportunity to come back to our baseline, or even supplement it a bit, as Ben was talking about, through some targeted investments.
thank you. Yeah, where I'm trying to go with this is putting aside sort of the unusual circumstances of our current recent situation, but sort of like, what is a long-term strategy? What is our current level of investment, where that tracks, where that would likely look into the future in terms of would we even be holding steady on our backlog of maintenance? Would we be chipping away at it at all? Just knowing where we're at now, and then do we need to augment, and what does augmentation get us? So I think that part of that would just be helpful to see where our current level of investment is getting us in terms of chipping away at that backlog.
So yeah, sorry. With some of the asset classes, that we have presented today, and again, these were not the full suite of asset classes that we have in our system, our backlog would continue to grow, as we've seen on some of the charts.
So Alicia, what I hear is when we'll bring back the baseline budget so the board really understands when we're talking about baseline, what that means, and break it down in terms of asset classes and compare it to both what Director Cush suggested, that planning effort we did, as well as to what you're asking, how it would fit kind of in these deferred projections we just looked at today. So I do think I think I understand what you're looking for, Director Schmidt.
Thank you.
I think the other thing too that we need to remember or be advised of is that going back to my car analogy, when's the last time you replaced a muffler in your car? The point being that materials are improving and we are replacing. This water district was formed from a bunch of small private water districts, water purveyors, let's say. And there's a lot of residual poor quality materials in the ground because of that. We are now replacing with class 1 plastic and cathodically protected welded steel. So the life of the pipe materials that are in the ground is going to be substantially longer than the life that has been achieved. Cast iron in the 60s and 50s was considered to be the cat's meow, but it turned out not to be such a cat's meow. The other two, welded steel with cathodic protection and PVC, I think potentially the life of PVC is infinite. I don't know what its life is. I know in landfills, they consider it that it'll never break down. So, just keep that in mind that we're replacing with better quality materials, which will extend the amount of life we get out of what we build and also reduce the 100-year life or increase the 100-year life, reduce the amount that has to be replaced to maintain 100-year life, because now we're at 150 or 175 even. So just keep that in the back of your mind.
Great, thank you. Let's see, any public comments right now on this portion?
Yeah, we do have one right now.
Great.
Okay, the first speaker we have is Mr. Larry Minikis. Go ahead, sir. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning, all. And Alicia, thank you so much for this. I want to mention that this presentation is not among the attachments this morning, so I hope it will be added to the website. And it's a very good idea to be looking ahead and doing modeling, saying if we don't do this in our asset classes, this is what it'll cost in the future. But the advantage you have and the difference between a lot of, say, businesses with a water district is looking back. Looking historically is just as valuable as looking forward. Take Smith saddle tanks as an example. If you model that and say, if we had done this work at year, say 20, at the cost in those dollars, where would we be today? How much more is it costing us today for not doing the work of the past? So if you do some modeling, you'll have a better idea of what the future holds for us. If we see where we could have done more, or we didn't have the funds to do it, and now we're sitting with projects that really need to be done. Pine Mountain Tunnel is a great example. That is critical at this point, and that should be in the funded class. That's just waiting to fail, and I giving the opinion that this should be one of the top projects that's being looked at going forward. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you. The next speaker we have is Mr. Roger Roberts.
Am I on? Can you hear me?
Sir.
We can
Loud
hear
and
you.
clear, Roger.
Okay. You do have a lot of competing investment requirements going forward. And I think it's important in the process for the district to establish clear criteria for who gets to the head of the line. I don't hear much about that as to what really needs to be done now versus what can be postponed and for how long. I would like to be able to hear that information, and I'm sure that's information that's available and can be presented because you're going to have to pick and choose not only for existing capital replacement, but for what you're going to do to increase water supply. And all of that has rate impacts, obviously. So that would be helpful to me at least. Thank you.
Thank you. There are
Great.
no further speakers.
No further. Okay, great. Let's keep it going. Brett, last item, COSA.
Yeah, so let me start sharing my screen here. Okay, so again, good morning. My name is Brett Uppendahl, Finance Director. And so this presentation here is an informational item, kind of going back to what we talked about at the beginning. We've presented quite a few updates over the last 6 weeks or so to the board on the cost of service analysis. There are many factors moving here. We're kind of starting to work our way towards decision-making process in terms of getting direction from the board. As we just talked about on capital, and then this discussion here will be on reserve targets. I'm not specifically looking for direction today, exactly where to go. I think that the purpose of my presentation today is to, kind of further unpack the initial recommendations that I had back in December in terms of our ranges that we're looking for. And so hopefully today's presentation, it would be my goal just to shed a little light on kind of why we're thinking of the ranges we have now, what we have in there, and obviously to take any feedback and direction from the board and from the public. So I have quite a few slides here, 15 or 20 slides. I'll go through them, happy to answer questions along the way. We'll talk a little bit about, where we're at in the process, revenue requirement, why that's important. And then we'll specifically talk about reserves. We'll talk about, the industry guidance, how we apply our agency specific analyses to that. And then, kind of flipping it around, how are others looking at us? How is the credit rating agencies looking at us? What are they expecting to see, from an agency like ours? So that's kind of the goal here for this morning's presentation on my end. This is a slide you'll see many times as we go through the cost of service analysis. And really what this is intended to do in the next slide as well is just to provide some context for the numbers you're about to see. There's a lot of numbers coming your way. I think, this one is context on the service. A lot of this speaks to what Alicia and Crystal just covered in the sense of our, infrastructure needs, our fixed costs, what we really have to do as a water agency to provide, fresh, clean drinking water to our residents and to our customers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. As it shows here, that requires 7 local reservoirs, 3 treatment plants, 900 miles of pipes and 100 pump stations. So we can serve our 60,000 connections, which makes its way through to 190,000 customers. A long way of saying we have a lot, a lot to account for, a lot to plan for. And as discussions earlier here this morning have indicated, a lot of it has complexity to the nth degree. So as we get into it, we will unpack those. When you roll it up on a budget basis, financial basis, these are the kind of order of magnitude we're talking about. Our total budget's $116 million as it is now. That's our baseline. When we talk about our baseline budget, that's 90 million or 92 million in operating, 23 or 24 million in capital. And that's what we have set up as last year's budget cycle. That's what we're trying to return to in general. As Ben just noted, those are the options that we'll be bringing to the board over the next few months. But that's kind of the general target, is just get back to our baseline, make some enhancements as determined by your board. When we talk about this, I think the key things here, and this is just summarized at the bottom, is that our expenditures as a utility, as a water agency that has a watershed and has a water treatment plant, 95% of our expenses are fixed. That means that there's very little correlation to how much water is used. We still have essentially sunk costs and costs we have to maintain just so that the service is provided regardless of whether people are using 50 gallons a day per person or 100 gallons a day per person. It really is a fixed cost operation in large part for us. On the flip side of that, the way we make our revenue is largely based on how much water is distributed. And so there's a mathematical relationship there. When water goes down, that has a high correlation. When water use goes down, I should say, that has a high correlation to our revenues and our bottom line, which is largely what I talked about on the first item. And again, I hope most of this is review for the board at this time, but I think it's good to, again, just set the context for, as we're talking about, budgets and rates and reserves, $100 million budget, 90 of that is operating. And we really have to take in I guess what I'm getting at here is because we have such a high portion of fixed costs, that really helps inform what level of reserves we have to take, right? And starts to kind of get into where are the risks and what happens in the good years, what happens in the bad years, right? Why are we talking about that for cost of service and kind of a rate setting exercise? Because it essentially leads into what is shown in the highlight here is what is the amount of revenue we need to pull in as a district to maintain our current operations, to account for future uncertainties, to make headway against the capital and needs, as we talked about in the last item. And so that revenue requirement is kind of still where we're at as a district here in terms of those final sets of inputs we need to be able to then design the rate structure around that. And so as I mentioned, we don't need firm direction today, but over the next couple of weeks we will be getting into we need to kind of hone in on this revenue requirement step. And that will really, largely start to inform the rate design questions that'll come our way in coming weeks. Okay, so this is a slide that was, shared at the onset in the December board meeting on rate setting, and I've highlighted there, what we're talking about today. So just to, not skip past every other item that's on this sheet here, but I think we have demand that we've talked about, and what is the right assumptions for overall customer demand. That's a big piece of the overall equation going forward. Today we'll talk about reserves there in the highlight, and I think the words that I have there, meaning we've used our reserves the last 2 years, our drought reserves, kind of our rainy day fund or lack of rainy day funds in this case. We've used those, and so those need to be replenished going forward so that we can be well prepared into the next period of uncertainty. We also have those other areas we're talking about, and those will be kind of fleshed out more in the budget process and whatnot. But inflation, purchased water as a backfill, water supply roadmap as we're really starting to hone in on water supply options, and then debt service as mentioned by Alicia. There's ranges here because obviously we don't know exactly what will be over the next 4 years, but the ranges indicate that we're somewhere between a $25 and a $40 million shortfall. So for just kind of summary purposes, I tend to say right around that $30 million range is really what we're looking at, and we can kind of hone in on that more over the next couple of weeks. But specifically with reserves, the range we're talking about, at least that I'm talking about here, is $5 million to $8 million per year. We need to start building back our reserves, and so the next couple of slides here are intended, as I mentioned, to kind of highlight why I'm saying $5 to $8 million over the next 4 years.
Just back to that last slide, Brett, just quick question on, can you just a little bit more on implementation of the water supply roadmap, $1 to $2 million. What is that? What's that assuming?
So as the board knows, I think we are still in the decision-making process for what the water supply solutions will be, and I think we just had a meeting on Tuesday, really kind of delving into that. And so what this part of the budget and the financial planning process is intended to capture is that even if we made the decision, this week or this month or whatever, about where we're going in water supply, it's going to take us a couple of years till we really get to that, actual implementation process. So this starts to capture the pre-design, some of the CEQA type studies, a lot of those kind of background actions we'll need to take in order to start getting our way towards that water supply solution. That'll likely be something that we, more fully fund in the next rate cycle, meaning not this next 4 years, but the subsequent 4 years. And so this is really just enough to get us going and fund all the studies essentially that we need. We will need to get our way towards implementation.
Yeah, I think to say even more succinct, this is intended to supply funding to support the implementation of the roadmap. Really full stop. This budget will support the implementation in terms of the next step of the studies required before we get to full design and construction. We're going to be reviewing this in detail, this specific item, again at the retreat, so the board can have confidence when we say we're funding the implementation of the roadmap, having understanding what we mean by that with more specificity than we have today.
And so with in this assumption of $1 to $2 million, are we, or do we have debt service for any capital projects associated with water supply and storage?
Not in this, no.
And so in the next 4 years, this is indicating that we would not invest in any water supply or storage.
Well, I think that the purchased water from Sonoma is part of the water supply resiliency analysis. So in essence, that would be implementing that by
That's just
budgeting it.
normal. That's just normal, right? That's not additional investment in infrastructure. I don't.
It is a revised strategy that will bring in additional water in the near term. It just doesn't require a capital project to implement.
Yeah, but this is exceeding the contractual minimum. So that's and that is a water supply strategy that's been included in the
Thank you.
the strategic water supply assessment. But I think that given where we are with that assessment, the amount of funds that we might expect to expend, again, recognizing that the implementing all the projects that will come out of that process is 10 years maybe and more. So what is really for the next 4 years, I guess, is what we need to be really trying to make sure we have sufficient funds to implement. So I think that is a particularly important aspect of the water supply assessment that we need to focus on, maybe more so than maybe longer term decisions, because we need to obviously bake this into our budget for the next session.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe just building on that, Monty. From the Tuesday presentation, there were pretty clear benchmarks, and I believe it was 2,500 additional acre feet of supply within the next 5 years. I think that was what was presented to us. So I hope we can draw a really clear line between this financial forecast for the next 4 years and the achievement of that additional 2,500 acre feet. If I'm remembering those numbers correctly, I'm not yet convinced that the figures presented here will actually achieve that target. So I hope that we can ensure that they are aligned, the target and what we need to spend.
And going, maybe just building on that, I agree with you, Ranjiv, and I would almost ask that given that there were a certain set of elements that we talked about on Tuesday that were common to almost all the options, because they kind of were seen as no regret scenarios, and that's why they were cooked into them. I would almost want to put a circle around the cost of implementing those and just maybe use that as a surrogate for what we would want to see included in our financial forecast for the water supply roadmap, because we need to have something to put into the budget, and that might be the highest level of specificity we have right now. And so I would, if we have a number that would be to implement those things, maybe that's what we ought to have in this going forward.
It's a good point. And to clarify my earlier comment, I actually do believe, in thinking about it, there were some relatively small capital investments to meet that short term, or maybe it was a midterm. So we are going to be reviewing this in detail, and we'll bring both the studies cost, which is reflected here, as well as linking together the earlier discussion we had on Tuesday of how those projects could be done.
And carrying it forward, Ben, it seems to me that it is impossible to set goals without knowing the cost of attaining the goal. I think the setting the goals is an interesting idea, but I think we have to have a cost attached to it to be able to get our arms around it.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think we do have to bring back, I think what we looked at was the targets that illustrative roadmap would bring in over the near, mid, and long. I don't believe they were designed as goals necessarily. So we do have to bring back that discussion, because there's limits to what we could do, and what it was really showing is what it would bring in, not pre-setting a goal to drive maybe less cost effective. But we're going to bring that back to. I do understand what the board's looking for in this.
Great. Thank you.
And just on this slide too, to be clear, this is the same exact slide as we had in December. So this is not necessarily incorporating any recent discussions. I was just trying to reset us back to kind of the December baseline target. And obviously we'll be refreshing this over the next few months. So back to kind of the reserve, discussion here. What do we have reserves for? Why do we need to replenish them? So the big reason, the biggest reason why we've been using our reserves the last 2 years is they were designed essentially, largely as drought reserves. And so you look at this chart here, it's very similar to the charts that I had in my first item, but it shows that we've had to rely on our reserves to backfill the revenue loss over the last 2 years, meaning last year and in this current year. And over those 2 years, the net impact to our reserves is something around $25 million. Well, obviously, we'll have to wait and see how the year ends here, but around $25 million is what's been backfilled by the use of our, we can call them drought reserves. And then so that's the idea, we need to replenish those in the next rate cycle. And and I understand we've had discussions about how do drought rates impact that, and so I'll get to that here in the next couple of slides. But nonetheless, I think any water agency needs to maintain a level of reserves for kind of drought reserves, because as I'll talk about in a minute, there are certain weather conditions and environmental conditions where we may still see loss of revenue, even though we're not into those areas where we would actually be going into the full drought reserve, or drought rate situation. So there still is a baseline level of drought reserves we need to keep in addition to just operating reserves. So I'll get to that here in just a minute.
And Brett, I've asked you this before, but conceptually that could be replaced with a line of credit, huh?
Yes, I think you're right in that. I think for emergency expenses, if you have it ready to go, that's not a bad, kind of backstop. I think that kind of gets into just overall debt at one point. And so, using debt for operating and, kind of having reserves that are cash funded, that's the trade-off. And I think, that's part of the discussion here in terms of what
would we have to carry it as debt, even though we hadn't used it? Because we could use it?
It doesn't affect the debt until we use it, but it is certainly available for credit rating agencies, to know. And I think any credit rating agency will assume we'll use that. And so that kind of takes up our capacity from their eyes. But to your point, if we haven't used it, we haven't used it. So it's good until it doesn't really count against you as much until you actually use it.
And understand, I'm not pushing it. It's just a question.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of what I mentioned here in the little kind of summary is kind of where we're headed here. So prior to 2021, our reserves were well funded, and we'll talk a little bit about how well funded they were. We've used them in the last 2 years to offset our revenue losses stemming from the drought. We're recommending a rate revenue target, so kind of building back our reserves through the rate cycle of between $5 and $8 million annually. So $5 million each year, up to $8 million each year to replenish them near where we were pre-drought over the next 4 years. So it's obviously too much to do it all in 1 year. So we're trying to think about what's the right pace in the next 4 years so that we can have a good target to shoot for. We talked about, the specific buckets and all the different, kind of ins and outs about what we would hold reserves for. There will be many opportunities for further analysis there. I think today what we're trying to kind of really focus on is industry standards and then our agency specific factors. And that's what the discussion here will start to delve into. So industry standards and our risk analysis. And again, this was somewhat covered in early January when I reported to the board in terms of a rate setting process. And so this is an expanded view of that based on some of the questions I received and some of the additional research I've done in the meantime. So you may recall this slide from early January. We have our 3 kind of buckets or our 3 reserves we consider to be unrestricted, or in terms of fungible as needed. I think ideally you'd like them to be well defined, but I think in practice, the 3 of these can be used together, and that is our capital reserve, our unrestricted operating reserve, and our rate stabilization reserve. So those are the 3 kind of lines going down. The board has well established policies on the minimum balances there for capital reserve. The policy was the annual budget, meaning about $20 million. Unrestricted reserve is 6 months of our annual budget, meaning about $45 million, 46 as it shows here. And then the rate stabilization reserve, we don't have a stated minimum there. So I have NA as a policy target. That was, developed as part of the 2012 bond funding round that we did, and it was intended to be used to backfill revenue to maintain our debt service coverage requirements. And you may recall that when we take out our bonds, we pledge to the bondholders that we will maintain a debt service coverage above and beyond just the bare minimum kind of operating budget. So that was intended to be kind of the transfer in and use of those reserves for debt service coverage. And so I see I show the policy target here down the middle, in fiscal 23 dollars. Bottom line, it adds up to about $65 million if we go, to the T on our policy. We look at our actual balance as we finished the year 2 years ago, in June of 2021. You add the numbers up there, very similar numbers, 63.1 million. And so you look at kind of the way the balance is going forward. It shows that use of reserves I mentioned, from 60 down to 40, from 40 down to 20, if things shake out this year the way we're expecting. So that's the decline we're trying to kind of build back. And as I show on the bottom there, the question that I received from the board is, how do we even know if these are the right targets, right? Is 65 million the right target? Is 63 million the right target? Are we okay where we're at now in kind of this $20-30 million range? And so then the next couple of slides start to inform that discussion. We talk about, what's the right target. We look to industry standards. The 3 industry standards are listed there: the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, as well as the International City and County Management Association, or ICMA as it's called, and then the Water Environment Federation, WEF. All of those are right around that same target, 1 to 2 months, maybe 3 months. And so kind of taking the middle of all that, you're saying we want a minimum of 2 months of operating budget. And when I look at that, they say that, and then all of a sudden they have 3 paragraphs on, but you should also analyze your own agency and, make adjustments for any agency specific factors that apply to you, as opposed to just the industry standard. And so typically they talk about your budget structure, the revenue volatility, your asset condition, and your credit ratings objectives. And so that's what we talked about in early January. It's all part of a package, right? I mean, you don't just set reserves absent of how do we budget. You don't set reserves absent of how our revenue structure comes in, or our capital needs. And then at the end of all that, you really want to be setting it towards how are they looking at us from credit rating agencies' perspectives, and what does that do to our future borrowing costs. And so what I've done here is I've kind of, as I just mentioned, trying to start to translate this into dollars. We look at our structural budget risk. Here at the district, and I think we've talked about this a few times, we've got a pretty lean budget. We've really cut out a lot of these contingencies. We don't have a lot of extra contingency in our operating budgets or capital budgets. We budgeted the minimum for water purchases in this last cycle. We don't have dedicated replacement funds for equipment. So we've kind of, really squeezed out a lot of that, maybe operating, the need. We squeezed out the extra room in our operating budget, so we would have to rely more heavily on reserves, is what I'm saying. We don't have it in our year-to-year budget, so if any of these things happen, we'd have to go right to reserves. We wouldn't have an operating kind of backfall there. The other side of that is revenues, right? Volatility. So we have about a 50% fixed fee structure or so, which helps us for sure. So we're less volatile than maybe other agencies that are much more on the variable revenue side. And then you can also add drought rates into our revenue structure to help mitigate the need for reserves. And so we'll talk about how that kind of plays in. I think, always we have unanticipated expenditures, right? None of us have a crystal ball. We have a 4-year rate cycle and a 2-year budget. So from the time you plan this until the time it's, completed, there are many risks that can come our way. Drought and inflation are 2 of the ones that are, come to mind recently, because those are the ones we're dealing with right now. Also unplanned infrastructure repairs when you have an older system, as Director Russell mentioned, that was, cobbled together, 100 years ago by a couple of different water purveyors. You may have unplanned repairs that need to get replaced. We talked about leaks and making sure we're not losing water in our leaks. And so those need to be kind of handled somewhere in the budget, either within your annual budget or within your reserves, or a little bit of both. And then we talked about how do we, be more strategic about this, and how do you, really, find ways to maximize efficiencies and or really take advantage of opportunities. And so you want reserves there to be able to either match grants that are coming your way, because whether it's FEMA or the WIFIA loans and the WRDA grants, oftentimes there's a matching requirement. And you may want to take advantage of economic conditions where you may be able to get economies of scale if you do a larger project in one year versus the next. And then on the flip side of that, there may be cost overruns and some capital issues, and you want to be able to complete the project without having to hamstring the rest of the capital program. So there's a reason why you may want to be strategic about having a larger reserve to give ourselves flexibility and be able to be more strategic in the future without having to cut somewhere else in order to make that happen. And then finally, we're all aware of California here, the potential issues with fire, floods, and earthquakes. And obviously we have FEMA as a backstop, and we have insurance funds, but those don't, necessarily all come together at the same time when you need them to. And there are also matching requirements, and there also could be needs to just have cash on hand at the time. So again, ways to mitigate it, but those are kind of the things we think about when setting reserves up, right? So that bleeds into here in terms of, what would be the range. And I'll admit here, kind of going into this, these are round numbers. These are not intended to be, a full-on risk analysis that we, certainly could undertake if we wanted to go down and really, line out every dollar in any one of these categories. But generally speaking, this is how I translate, all that guidance and all of our experience here at the district into what might that mean on a kind of a low and a medium and a high scale, spectrum type of a thing. So you just kind of walking down through the numbers here, and I know there's a lot of numbers here, but if you kind of take that industry minimum standard at the top there, the AWWA standard, 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months, kind of pick your target there, right? Do you add in another layer because we don't have a very, I should say, because we have a very thin budget, we don't have a lot of operating contingencies built in, then you kind of either risk it on the low end or you start to build in a little bit of reserves in the back end, whether it's $2.5 or $5 million just to kind of match your operating budget. And I say 0 to 5% of operating budget because our operating budget's about 100 million. If you think about, any endeavor you take, trying to be perfect on it is unlikely. So you want to build in a 2, 3, 5, maybe even a 10% contingency. So I showed the 0, the 2.5, and the 5% scenarios here. The fact that we don't have dedicated replacement funds, again, if one of our big service trucks goes out, or if we really need to replace a critical computer system around here, those aren't getting any cheaper. And we have some pretty heavy equipment and pretty old equipment here. So rather than having to cut somewhere else, you'd like to have at least something aside to be able to get the purchase going for a replacement on key equipment, vehicles, or technology. Water purchases, we just talked about how to secure our water supply to make sure in the low year we can import enough water from Sonoma in this case to make sure we have water here for our customers. Down into the revenue categories, rate structure risk. I've structured that. You see 2 lines in a row there under revenue volatility. Rate structure risk and drought reserve. And those are just mathematical kind of representations of if you have in the 4-year cycle, 2 years of kind of a 5 to 10%, it says conservation scenario, but 5 to 10%, below where you expected. Those would be about the ranges, 5 on the low end, 10 on the high end of what you might need to hold to backfill revenue and kind of a classic, drought reserve. And then the next one is more of, I call it drought reserve there because that would be something that you could maybe mitigate with drought rates, right? The same kind of, 10%, your first 10%, then your next 10%, right? So the first 5 or 10%, we're probably not going to use drought rates. So you kind of need to hold that. The next 10%, when you're from the 10 to 20 range, then you start getting into maybe drought rates start to mitigate that, right? So that would be a line that you would hold if you don't have drought rates. And then if you do have drought rates, you may consider pulling that line back a little bit, right? So similar mathematical relationships there, but it's just meant to say as a percent of our overall revenues, if you get some, volatility in there, those are the ranges, over 2 to 3 years, you'd likely want to backfill in time to reset your rates. Asset conditions, the next one, and I'll spend a lot of time there, but our CIP, is about 20 million a year. So, if you want to kind of hold, 25% of that, 50% of that, up the line, that's kind of how we look at our overall system of the likelihood of having an unanticipated repair. And then grant matching funds, right? If you want to have a 25% local match for something between a $25 and $50 million award, those would be the ranges, 6 million to 12 million. And finally, on the bottom, holding enough to be able to kind of keep operations going, meet the FEMA requirements, cash fund things up front, and then hope for the FEMA typically operates on a reimbursement basis. So you have to cash fund, get reimbursements a year or 2 later, having some sort of a level of, FEMA's not always the easiest auditing agency to get all of our money back from. So you can't just assume a full recovery from FEMA. Obviously, there are situations where they're more and less lenient. And so, between $5 and $20 million might be a good guess there. And that also includes money for response and mitigation and insurance deductibles in the meantime. But again, these numbers could be debated left, right, up, and down. This is not a perfect, analysis, but it gives you a range. And the range is on the low end, 36 million, on the high end, 100 million. If you kind of go right back into that medium range, again, we're right in that 60 million range, which if you remember from a few slides ago, that 60 million range is about where our policy leads us to and about where the 2021, actuals would lead us to. So to me, that leads me to believe that, $60 million is probably a good range for us to shoot for, plus or minus if you really want to flesh this out. And so that's what it says there at the bottom is at the middle of the range, 69.5 is about equal to our policy and about equal to our fiscal 21 funding level. So that's one way to look at it.
Just going back quickly, I think this
Sure.
is great. Thank you. This is, I think, what Ranjiv was pointing at a few meetings ago of trying to get a better analysis of why we have it. And just jumping to an opinion, I do believe that middle case does make sense, with the only change of taking out the drought reserve of 9 million and having that be put into our drought rate structure, which would be important for the community to realize that if they conserve, then we're less likely to have rates go up. So it'd be in essence, a communication reward for conservation. And so I would take it out of here and put it in the drought based rates. I don't know if you want other comments on this now, or you want to keep going on the presentation.
Happy to take comments now.
Great.
There are any, yeah.
Yep. And
Okay,
we're getting tight on time, so let's make it quick.
I think it was a great presentation, Brett, well thought through. The one thing missing though, and I think it needs to be added to your list of 3 to make it 4, is some kind of pension issue. I don't like the term unfunded liability, but that's the term that's used commonly in the public. I think that would be helpful, at least in the long run, to show at least a placeholder there. We have $2 million in that now. And I don't know what the number is, but it's substantially bigger than 2 million.
And that's a really good point, and it's a cost that we have very little control of, and so I think it probably might belong here in terms of that operating budget. Fortunately for us, and this is probably a topic for another day, but fortunately, CalPERS at least now has implemented more of a smoothing mechanism, to their charging structure. As I started to talk about in the first item, we're a little bit of a lag, so we'll kind of always know about where we're headed, and we'll get that smoothed out by some of their actuarial methods. But it is not inconsequential, to your point. It can really have a couple $1 million swing in any given year. And so I think it is really a good point to have that as part of our risk analysis for expenses.
Well, and it's a 9-figure number if you look at it in the big picture.
Oh yeah, overall unfunded liability, definitely. It's not something we can necessarily take on. But I'm talking about as they translate that to our annual required
I got it.
contributions.
Yeah,
how
that's a very good idea. Smoothing that out. That's kind of like the drought.
Yep, exactly.
Something you can't predict.
Yep.
Yeah.
Brett, just one other addition.
Sure.
Maybe if for future discussion, it would be helpful if you, Ben, and others have any perspectives on where more immediate investment in risk mitigation would reduce the amounts that we need to have on hand for, an untoward event. I mean, very basically, for example, if I invest a lot in fire protection or earthquake protection for my house, I anticipate that I'll have hopefully less to pay out when we do have one of those events. So we just have a sense of if there are investment opportunities that we can take advantage of that alleviate the need to maintain large amounts to mitigate disasters or catastrophes. Just be great if you could identify any areas where there could be an opportunity.
Brett, I wanted to mention, if I could, one other. As we think about reserves, for me, I think about 2 variables. One is what we're talking about, which is what we may want to shoot for in terms of reserve level. The other one that's maybe even more important in context of the rate setting is thinking about the rate to get there. So the replenishment rate. And of course, the slower it is, a bit more risk, but it is an important variable as we're thinking about the rate setting, because we'll be talking about the dollars per year to replenish reserves. And I do feel, there's quite a bit of reasonable policy latitude as we think about the rate of replenishment.
That's a great point, Ben, and I think we should give some thought to that. I also thought that Director Russell's question about whether we could achieve this reserve in part with a line of credit that allowed us to access it if needed. But so I think that's another strategy. I do want to also just ask, and this maybe goes back to one of Director Smith's first sort of questions is bringing this to us, you've just done a lot of work to tee up the concept of what level of reserves we should plan for. I'd like to, encourage that if we have gone to that level, and we might be at a point where we could say, let's make a decision. I know we don't make decisions at our committee meetings, but we can refer to the board around a decision. We have so many decisions that are pending. If we think, if in presenting this to us, that you would like us to actually make some sort of referral to the regular board meeting around what we should choose as our planning objective. And that doesn't have to happen right this second if we're not ready, but I want to encourage us to where we can make incremental decisions. And so
thank you, Monty. And I tried to, I put a proposal out in the beginning of these comments, and I'd love people's responses to that. I agree. And then we are getting overtime here. So any comments from the board?
I have 2 or 3 slides still left that will start to speak to that. And,
Great.
and if you're okay with that, Chair Smith, I'll try to hit them rapidly and not too rapidly. But I think the one thing I wanted to pull into this is, we have our internal analysis that we can run through on this. We also get looked at by credit rating agencies, and as we talk about future debt borrowing and potentially for water supply or capital investments, it's just something to keep in mind. And I think the one thing about this, as I was kind of anticipating the discussion today, is that we can certainly debate levels within our own agency or how well we are compared to others, but that's what credit rating agencies do. They establish benchmarks for all of these, right? And so when we were upgraded back in 2019, a big portion of why we were upgraded to a stable AA was because we recently adopted our CMF, which is a fixed fee revenue source, and also because they expected our financial metrics to remain, well above the bond covenant minimums. And that just basically says, we're not just going for the bare minimums required by our bond covenants, but we're actually maintaining a higher level than that. So those are things they continue to evaluate. Did they stay, did the CMF help them? And then, are they still maintaining above that minimum? I have some slides here that kind of really break down the credit rating process, but I'll skip through some of these other than to point out that financial strength there here in the middle is 40% of that. So they're really looking at financial strength as they should. When you look at financial strength, and I'll skip to this next slide because it speaks to the same thing. These are the categories they're looking at. They're looking at debt service coverage, which is, do you have enough in your operating to pay your obligations and then some? Cash on hand is what we're talking about today. Reserves, how much cash do you have in case you need it, right? And then debt to operating is kind of like a leverage number they look at, as well as a kind of a forward looking, how flexible could you be if you had to change things around? So 40% of what they're looking at is in these categories. And this is produced by Moody's. When you look into how they look at, different agencies, and how they score us, we're currently a AA. That's what the arrow is showing us there. These are the metrics they give us, right? And so I'm really focusing for today on the cash on hand, which is the middle 15% there. And they're looking for us to be in this 150 to 250 in terms of days of cash on hand. And there's a whole calculation for that, but it basically breaks down your operating budget to a daily perspective and how many days do you have of your operating budget that you could fund with reserves. That's a standard metric they use. When you look at that, this slide's kind of getting at cash on hand here in the middle, right? Their benchmark, at the minimum for AA rating is 150. As I'll show you here, as we dwindle our reserves this year, we're edging below that a little bit towards that 111 mark, as I show projected 2023 on the right-hand side. And not ideal, not enough, I think, on its own to necessarily warrant any kind of an action, but it certainly would start to kind of, edge on their analysis. And then if you look down lower, AWWA has a similar benchmark, right? They survey all the agencies out there, all the water agencies, and they actually separate ones that are wastewater and water from those that are just water. So I've used the just water ones here, and they say, 75th percentile median and 25th percentile. And you can see here that our days of cash on hand, if we keep this trajectory, will be below the 25th percentile. So again, not enough on their own to warrant an action, but certainly trajectory-wise, something we want to avoid. And so the reason why I put that slide there is because I wanted to, this is kind of, what Director Hornstein was getting to, or General Manager Hornstein was getting to, what's the rate of replenishment, right? And so this is, again, I'm not asking for a decision now, although, I think the input has been noted. And I think we'll come back to the board or this committee, in coming days and weeks to really kind of get more of a decision on this. But the 3 scenarios here are, if we just don't do any reserve replenishment, so we don't do any at all across the top there, you can see our cash on hand dwindles down to, under 100 in the next couple of years. And I think the one key distinction in this is that I'm assuming for this particular model is our unrestricted reserve there flattens out at 28 million, right? So that means we're no longer dipping into reserves each year to balance the budget. We have a balanced budget on the top end, but we're not building back. And so that is a pretty key assumption in this, right? We're not continuing to use reserves. We would flatten it off after this year. Even with flattening it off, you're going to see our days of cash on hand, dwindle, as it shows on the right. Scenario one would be, balance our budget plus, 5 million per year to build back our reserves. And you can see with the yellow highlight, that gets us back to that 150 or so metric, that kind of, middle of the minimum for a AA rating by the 4th year of the rate cycle, right? So that would be kind of the trajectory to get us there for 4 years. It would be a $5 million level. If you look at the scenario 2, that's the $8 million level, right? That's the high end of our recommendations for consideration. And what that does is that puts us right at that 150 mark by that 2nd year of the rate cycle, right? So again, the rate cycle will cover fiscal 24, 25, 26, and 27, a 4-year forward-looking rate cycle. If you do that, that scenario 2 in the bottom, that would put us in a good position after the 2nd year to be able to have those benchmarks that warrant our AA rating and would kind of help us, as we go out looking for debt service. So that's what it says in the bullets are at the bottom. We can kind of take a slower pace at the 5 million mark, a quicker pace at the 8 million mark. They have different, obviously, endpoints. And in both scenarios, and this is something I did want to point out, in both scenarios, we would still not attain where we were in 2021. So it's not a full recovery of our reserves. It would just be getting us back to those levels that are more expected of an agency our size. And then kind of embedded in all of this is this concept. And again, this is not necessarily, probably lost on you, but as our operating budget grows every year, right, it's going to grow with inflation. It's going to grow, with cost of doing business. Mathematically, that would mean that our reserves have to grow also, right? We'll lose ground if we have flat reserves, in these kind of like ratios and metrics. And so my final bullet is to maintain a steady cash on hand. Once we get to our current levels and we're good there, we're still probably gonna have to put $1 million or $2 million in reserves each year just to kind of maintain that level of cash on hand for this type of a metric. So I know that was fast, and I know that there's a lot in there. So that's kind of why
just back to the last one. I mean, this is a lot, and we are tight on time, but this is quite sobering to me. So I think what you are saying is, even at the $8 million annual reserve replenishment, we should expect not to have AA bond rating for several years.
So I wouldn't go that far. Like I said, this is one factor in the ratings. They take into account a lot of other things, and this is, I think, I don't want to say worst case scenario, but it's one metric that is not going in our favor. So
maybe as a guidance, we can point towards maintaining our AA rating would be a goal, and let's see if we can do it.
I think that would be good. And I think a lot of this goes with the story. When we talk about credit ratings, the story goes with, how do we manage our rate increases and how do we manage this overall financial picture? And if we're to set a plan up that says we're going to get there in 4 years, that has weight to it, right? That part of what I see in the last upgrade from 2019 is the forward-looking plan and the setting the kind of the 4% per year inflationary riders and that kind of a thing. So they'll take into account our plans and our intents with this. It doesn't have to be an overnight, right back to
particularly, Brett, particularly if it's a board adopted 4-year increase, it shows a trajectory. I think it's a really good point. And I was thinking it as well. They really will look at the body of that rate increase and not necessarily say, well, year 1, you're behind some benchmark.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so a lot of this I said already. I'm not going to spend time recapping. I know we're late on time, but it just outlines that these are 3 ways of looking at it. I think the 5 to 8 million range has merits on either side, 5 or 8. And I've heard the direction from you, Chair Smith, today, and so we'll bring this back at a later date with maybe a more full discussion and kind of ask for more specific direction, but with time to digest and time to kind of see what this means.
Any other comments from the board before we get to public comments on giving feedback to the team?
Yeah, Jed, just one point. I think, Brett, you've been trying hard to present our various trade-offs in the decisions we have to make. If one of the goals is to maintain a AA bond rating, which I think makes a lot of sense, there will be things that we may have to give up on. For example, reducing our ability to invest in capital improvements, or reducing our ability to achieve supplemental water supplies at the rate that we hope to do so. So it's hard to make a decision on any one of these aspects, for example, setting a reserve target, without understanding the impacts on our other objectives. So I would suggest that we try not to push for a decision on one isolated issue like a reserve target until we understand what the impacts are going to be on our ability to achieve other goals, full staffing levels, all the other financial aspects of that we've been discussing.
I agree. We have to have a comprehensive view of all of it. We can't look at this piecemeal and one at a time. We have to look at it all together. So thank you, Ranjiv. Comments, Larry Russell? Guidance for the team?
No, I'm cool. I think it's one of the best presentations I've seen on this issue. I think it gives a good feel for where we're going and where we are. It's going to be a heavy lift, guys. So it's coming.
Agreed. Thanks, Larry. Monty?
No, only to thank Brett. This is really, really helpful. And it's really the kind of picture we need. So thank you. I know that a lot of work went into it.
Great. Anything else, but Ben, before we go to public comment from you?
No, I don't.
Okay. Terry?
We have two speakers, Mr. Roger Roberts and then Mr. Larry Minikis. Go ahead, Mr. Roberts.
You can hear me, I trust. Yes?
Yes.
This is very revealing, and thank you for this presentation. The reserve policy is an interesting problem in the context of all the other financial demands that exist for the district at present times. And so this leads me to the question of the activities with COSA and whether or not the drought rate is part of COSA at the time when we apply for increasing rates, or is that a separate exercise? And I would like to understand how much the drought rates as are conceived or constructed will assist in maintaining the targets for reserves. I think that's important to understand. Thank you.
Unmute.
Okay.
Terry, I think you have Larry Minikis next, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. And I'll, in the interest of time, I'll be brief. As you go forward in planning, we have ample water this year, but what conservation does when you instill conservation in the people becomes habitual, and that planning going forward should look at lower water sales per capita, regardless of how much water we have. And I just want to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are no further speakers.
Well, terrific. Yeah, thank you, Larry, for that. I do think there was a question in the last board meeting. I think it was by Christy, who asked whether we should continue to conserve. And the short story is, yes, this is an important pattern for us going forward. And so, last year it did not rain from January 5th to April 15th, maybe an inch or two. And we have no idea how to predict when drought's coming back, except that it will. I think I'll just summarize. Thank you, Brett, for a tremendous, thoughtful presentation. We got a lot of work ahead of us. And Ranjiv, I think your idea to tie all of this together with a full plan, integrating storage, supply, infrastructure investments, watershed preservation, recreation plan, we need to have all that tied into the rate process here. So it all comes together, and I'm looking forward to working with the team in the coming weeks and months. With that said, I think we can close out. So
Have a good day, folks.
Adjourn. Thank you very much.